where that song that was playing about 2 minutes ago is from. Excellent. So I'm going to talk about navigating the overworld of open source. And I want you to reach into your inner child and find the joy that those kind of songs give you as they give me. So, it's dangerous to go alone. Take this. Why would I take two seemingly dissonant things, Zelda, original Zelda, 1986 Zelda on NES, and cloud native and open source, and put them together and find commonalities? So let's go for a ride. Here I am. I'm here because I love studying history. That was one of my double majors at university, as well as computer science. And I love studying history and software, and I'm fascinated by how it has changed the world. And you can find me at Twitter. So, the overworld. Vision? Confusion? So, maps. Who's a fan of maps? Maps are really cool. They're great, right? They tell you where you are. They tell you where you need to go, geographically, spatially. Who knows what this is? This is a partial map. This is the opening screen on the Legend of Zelda. And it's a small piece of a map. And it doesn't force you to only make one choice in this particular game, right? It was an adventure game in the 1980s, and you have three choices here. We can talk about game theory, but you can either go over to the right or to the east. You can go up to the north, or you can go into this little black square, which is an 8-bit for a cave, right? This is the overworld. How many of you know about the overworld? So we kind of came to know about the overworld indirectly, and the theme song that you just heard was the theme song when you were above at sort of a bird's eye view playing Zelda. And the thing about the overworld is that what made me fall in love with it, not was just because I had a nerdy interest in maps, but I instantly recognized the usefulness of what an overworld could do, especially in Zelda. So you could play the game and you could understand where your choices were going to be and where you could go next, right? And then you can also see what was coming ahead. You could see where you were and behind. And so much of the immediate gameplay takes place in a small grid, but then once you get to the other levels, you can see the rest of it. And it was non-linear and it was wonderful. And for anyone who was a adventure role-player game, in modern days, the maps, they're still there. So this started a trend. And the downside of maps is that they kind of feel like you can become confused and not know where to go because you have too much choice and the map is too sprawling. And that's definitely something that we find in cloud native and open source. But for the most part, I show this overworld because the main purpose served by an overworld in any given game like this is to connect more important places. So I highlighted that peak square, and I want you to understand that the only people who understand the overworld are the people who have dived down and gotten into the weeds of each and every grid in this particular game. And so it's the bottom center. And this is a fundamental paradox about maps and vision and strategy and implementation. So most of us in this room are developers or have been or work in development. And so you are down in the weeds. You're debugging every single blade of grass and every little drop of water on the waterfalls. And so it's hard to kind of understand where you are and in the landscape of things because you just need to get the thing to work. Or your uptime, it's down and you're on call. And that's kind of how I feel about the paradox between people who are software developers and people who have to kind of think about where we're going to go and move us together in a more strategic way. So I kind of go back to Zelda, and the thing I want to say is it's dangerous to go alone. Take this. So take what exactly? So who knows what this is or has seen this? This is, and you can go to that link, is the landscape of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And the reason why I use Zelda as the overworld for my talk title is because I came upon this thing about 3 years ago, which is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation is the second incarnation of the Linux Foundation. For those of us who have been around that long, RIP Linux Foundation. But I've been watching it grow for the last 3+ years since they've started doing it. And it immediately reminded me of the Zelda overworld. So, maybe you can't see that far, but I have a big orange arrow pointing up to this header bar. And this is what it says, overwhelmed. And I highlight that because that's exactly what many people see when they see any given detailed map, right? Or an overworld, right? And especially this cloud native foundation, right? And it also does, that's the downside of any kind of map when you don't know where you need to go, you don't know where your next move is going to be. And it does the same thing to newcomers who are trying to learn a language, an ecosystem, a corner of an ecosystem, keeping up with JavaScript frameworks, and you know the deal. So, this is what the Cloud Native Foundation decided to do to solve that overwhelmment. They came out with something called a trail map. And lo and behold, it's got green fields and paths and dragons and lakes, just like the Zelda map. I mean, I'm just geeking out here in my 80s nostalgia way. But more importantly, what this trail map does is that it tells you where to go first on your journey. And so it helps you understand what are the foundational things that you need to understand before moving on to the next thing. And it acts as a scaffolding to build your cloud native app or your distributed system or your company one step at a time without moving steps or skipping steps so that you're confused. So anyway, this is a great way to give a landscape, and the trail map helps to digest the information in a sequence, but we're missing the rest of cloud native here because there's an elephant in the room. I don't know if that's an idiom used in Austria, but actually there's a lot of elephants or a lot of clouds. So many of these companies that are featured in the cloud native landscape are going to use public cloud providers to run their companies. But these providers are starting to offer competing services for cheaper or as a bundled solution. And depending on where you sit, either this is going to be a problem or an opportunity. So first, let's discuss the problems. This is, on the one hand, there's this view. So I'm going to do interpretive reading of a quote. It comes down to, can your open source project make money on a cloud offering if they're not a cloud provider? If the answer is no, essentially the cloud providers will be the ones making money from open source. Many who have been in open source for anything longer than 3 to 5 years have been feeling this very hard. The quote is from Bassam Tabara. He's the one that has written some cloud native incubators, including Rook, which is a block storage solution, Upbound, and Cloudplane. Who knows who this fella is? Michael de Haan. So if you're in DevOps, you know that he created Ansible. And so he says something earlier this February, as we increasingly build less of a system ourselves due to cloud services and increasingly involve more base libraries, the skills gap in engineering also widens. And the distant future may involve 20x engineers building systems for 1x engineers with ratios of 1 to thousands. So some of these people that are in here and that have been building things in open source, they're starting to feel like cloud providers are encroaching on the things that they've traditionally built. And so this is kind of where I feel like we've evolved in terms of cloud native and open source in 2018. If you remember the Anderson Horowitz essay, if you haven't read it, it is definitely a part of our canon and history, and it was an essay in 2011 called Software is Eating the World. Many of you, if you haven't read it, go read it. But we've heard that, and now I want to say it looks like software is eating the world, open source is eating software, and cloud is eating OSS. And then I saw this, and I almost felt too prophetic in terms of seeing this, first the fish on Twitter, and then seeing that IBM acquired Red Hat, who had acquired CoreOS. And so with that acquisition, I noticed that there was a consolidation around these large cloud giants. And of note, again, Red Hat acquired Michael de Haan's company, Ansible. So how can companies, if you're working for one, who are developing open source software or basing their companies on open source software survive today? Do they need to be acquired by a cloud provider, like GitHub got acquired by Microsoft, or do they defend their turf? So cloud, I want to talk about how cloud is disrupting OSS monetization strategies. First, for how they're doing it in the first two, and then how they're evolving in order to respond to that. The first, of course, is very popular Red Hat support model, right? And Red Hat just got acquired by IBM for $34 billion, so that model certainly works. But it is a tough model to monetize on. Maybe you don't care about monetization, but you might get a company that gets acquired and then you have to adjust, or you're going to get laid off because of redundancies. And so somehow, some way, if you've been in this business long enough, you're going to be a victim of it, or it's going to be impacting you in some kind of way. The next model is hosting, and this is the model that cloud providers have now used to the detriment of smaller companies. And we've seen cloud providers gone from just offering this raw infrastructure as a service and compute to storage services to offering massively rich buffet menu style suite, app level and infra level offerings across the entire software development lifecycle and stack. And so when I talk about the three biggest cloud giants, AWS has 140 plus platform services beyond basic compute. Azure has about 100 plus. Google, with the Cloud Next that was happening this week, also just offered more, and they're catching up to both Azure and cloud. So how are companies reacting? Well, for one, they're rechanging their licensing. And anyone who's not a lawyer is going to have to become a lawyer in order to try to understand. And it's designed to defend against the public cloud providers. And of course, the biggest drawback to this is that these licenses are kind of hurting adoption, especially if you're within an ecosystem, and it's turning off potential users. So it seems like the jury is still out as to whether or not it's working, but companies are using this. The next two, I think, are the ones that are kind of creating the new movement in open source. The first is open core, and I call this idea of a core being skinny or thick, which is how much do you want to open source and how much do you want to keep closed and in your core. So open core is misunderstood, right? Because few experts, including Google, where I work now, and major OSS company founders, agree on implementation specifics and approaches and trade-offs. But when you look at the profits and earnings of the top 100 open source products, you'll notice that they all use this model. And so I believe open core is going to be the dominant business model used by the most successful companies going forward, at least in the near future. And the most fundamental aspect, of course, is how much is going to stay closed versus open. I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about the next thing, which is this idea that the last three monetization strategies are the proof that we've entered into a new movement for software innovation. And so an article written about 4 years ago by NGINX, now acquired by F5 recently, so to just prove my point on this consolidation, is that it talked about this 3 different stages or generations of open source software, and you see them here, 3 different eras, right? And the first one was free software, so it was the instigators, Richard Stallman and the Free Software Foundation, and the relation to proprietary software is that PS is evil, right? Ballmer, Linux is a cancer, right? Definitely that era. Then the second one, 1996 to 2013, they kind of understood that they needed to play with it because, you know, there's a lot of open source developers of us out there. We need to get paid. So there needs to be some sort of monetization, and they kind of tried to understand. But now, whether people realize it or not, we're in a 3rd stage, and we're actually at the cusp of it, and it's called commercial OSS, or COSS. And this is the sense that we are basically leaving the OSS behind and coming into the COSS, and there's already a cohort of open source companies, some of which are public, that are surpassing 100 million in revenue. And I already mentioned Red Hat, right, which sort of truly made open source arrive in terms of like a for-profit kind of thing. And so I really wanted to talk about why commercial open source is the future and why we should care and why we just need to embrace it. Because I'm going to out myself. I'm one of the stuck in my 2nd generation, not wanting to embrace it. I sort of am thinking that's not pure and dirty. But anyway, what do commercialization and commoditization bring? Let's talk about some other things that happened before we were born, or this pattern happened in other industries. And I think also the talk earlier today about Sparta touches a little bit about it. But one is cars. We're never going back to horses and buggies. And I'm sure the people that were manufacturers of wagons and horseshoe manufacturers were very much opposed to it. But look at the industries that sprouted up in their stead. The second one, and I could go on forever about this, is the electricity grid. Time check. The electricity grid of 100 years ago is the same as the transformation that's happening in Kubernetes today, right? And so, I don't know about Michael de Haan's thoughts about commoditizing infra and other abstraction levels that will lead into a reduction in developer jobs, but this invention of cars and the electricity grid, it really is commoditizing for us to move forward, because that is progress, and people who can stay agile and adaptive in this will find this new movement exciting, especially as a developer, right? And this brings me to me taking pictures of sewer plates. How many of you maybe follow me on social media or unfollow me because I share way too many pictures of sewer plates? I do. It's my collection. I have a collection, and this was right on the Linz train station. I said, ooh, my new collection Linz. Why do I take pictures of manhole covers and sewer plates and iron plates? Because when you speak on building on near free open source technology, think about water and water sanitation and sewer systems, all the way back to the Roman times and before. We're talking Mesopotamia. And just imagine if our predecessors got upset because they didn't want cities and municipalities to get a hold of private sewer technology and provide it efficiently to the masses. So the point I'm trying to make is that infra, when it's made available to all, it democratizes us to start building the things that we can truly care about and we can truly use to change the world. So, all right, so we're back to this. Yes, this is largely true, but it's going to be replaced by this. Multi-cloud. Software eats world, OSS eats software, cloud eats OSS, multi-cloud eats cloud. Hybrid and multi-cloud is going to be eventually the modus operandi of running all distributed systems on the internet, curiously powered by commercial open source. And portability is going to reign supreme. And portability is, of course, it's not binary. There's always shades of gray. Of course, we thought all our problems were going to be solved when Docker came out, and we know that the headaches were just beginning, right? But we're going to always try to aim towards that. And the cloud providers that work with open source companies to make things as portable as possible for companies large and small alike will be the ones that will be the most in demand in this new wave of open source. So let's talk a little bit about cloud native, and then I'm going to finish up. 3 things about cloud native. It's still in its infancy. Even if you're living and breathing and eating it the way that I have been, we're only about 5 or 10% of the way there in terms of the transition to fully cloud-based computing, believe it or not. And the transition will never 100% swing over to cloud, because we're just still selling millions of racks and switches and compute storage services to enterprises. So they're building out their physical colocation. So we're talking F5, you know, that they're probably a reason why they bought out Nginx and Cisco and IBM and HP. And so this market is not dead. Hardware is not dead. The next thing, hybrid and multi-cloud will increasingly be a reality for decades to come. And we don't, so there's inertia, there's the sunk costs, there's the heterogeneity of trillions of M&A over the past 50 years and growing. And they're powering infrastructure IT for the entire enterprise, and this isn't going to just change in a paradigm in one short decade. And the last, OSS enables the wonderful future of cloud computing. So it is clear that OSS, or COSS, commercial open source software, will unlock the future potential of cloud computing in a world that looks very different from the one that we are in today. And that's already started to happen. So an example besides sewer plates, although I can talk on about sewer plates if you want to. I mean, you know, I have a problem with that in Zelda. But anyway, EC2. So EC2 is really a black box indirect commercialization of SEN, right? The OSS hypervisor, where AWS captured lots of value around the business of spinning up this compute instance more quickly and ephemerally, right? But then we see Kubernetes replacing EC2 as the abstraction for compute. And Google's OSS strategy was chosen to speed up this commoditization of the more fundamental proprietary infrastructure as a service, PaaS services that competitors had assumed. And there's this massive network effects there around. So Kubernetes has now forced a fungible and liquid compute dynamic across all the leading clouds, AWS, Azure, and GCP. And this is just the beginning. So, closing thoughts. Developers, you have the decision-making power more than ever before. What you find cool, what you find to be less toil, will be what will just be the deciding factors for CIOs, CTOs, C-suite. And this was something that did not exist 10 years ago, or nay, I even say 5 years ago. And so I think that what's great about this is that you get to choose, and you get to choose the thing that matters most to the business and also matters most to you. And that is the power of commercial open source and cloud. Open source itself, as I discussed, has changed in the last few years with cloud. And now it's not about using open source as evil, but it's a must-have to succeed today. And finally, commercialization, commoditization, will bring wonderful new opportunities. And remember, OSS will always eclipse cloud. And I leave you with this. If you remember the overworld, whether you like Zelda or not, whether you like maps or not, whether you like iron covers or not, to have vision, you need to kind of fly up above. You need to refer to your overworld. But you cannot implement unless you are in the details. And so there's got to be the paradox that you balance. You've got to hold that overworld gently in your head as you play the game. And this could be the OSS game, or game plan that you use, or the game of your career, or the game of your life. And what an idea would it be if you can write an overworld map for your life. I assure you, try it as an exercise and it will change you. So, we come back to this. It's dangerous to go alone. Take this. Take your clouds, take your frameworks, take all that open source technology, because we are standing on the shoulders of giants, and we can go far, as the African proverb says, to go fast, go alone. To go far, go together. Thank you.